You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a technical point of view. Hey, glad to have you on board. Hope your week went well. I have finally finished up some of the contracts that I've been on. Just need to send a bill to a couple of them, but I am finally kind of seeing some daylight there. So I'm assuming that many of you out there are already in the thick of it here as I'm recording at the end of May, and some of you are probably already looking for how do you get a break. So nevertheless, make sure you get some rest out there, and that you make sure you are rested enough so that you don't make mistakes, especially when you're on those ladders. So definitely be careful out there. If you want to learn more about wildlife damage management, you can definitely visit my website and download some of the materials that we have there in terms of ordering them. My Wildlife Removal Handbook, 3rd edition. If you are relatively new in the industry and you're looking for sort of a book that's going to get you started in the right way when it comes to animal control for a lot of the foundational species that are going to be the bulk of your income, this is the book for you. So it's 3rd edition, revised and expanded. So it's still sort of a classic right now, and that can be very useful for your work in wildlife control. I know a lot of people don't want to read anymore, but there's something to be said about reading where you can take notes and see things, but that's certainly some training material. All right, well, let's talk about what we're going to deal with this particular week. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of information on what I called 5 tips for success in wildlife damage management. So basically, if you're thinking about getting into wildlife control, what are some of the things you should consider before you leap? Because one of the challenges that face people is they like, I like being outdoors, I like trapping, I like, making money. If I can make money doing that, it would be like heaven. And people sometimes confuse the joy of their hobby as something that's going to make them a living. Now, for many people that can happen, but there is a switch that occurs when you move from something that is a hobby that you might get a little money for, or perhaps not, and something that you're driven to make a living on. That becomes a fundamentally different animal altogether. So, especially when you start thinking about, quitting your job and getting into wildlife control, is this something that you can do? So I wanted to give you basically 5 tips before you jump into the field of wildlife control. Now, I'm not going to be just a negative Nelly here, but I want you to, sometimes when people get an idea, they get excited, and so we want to kind of make sure we pump the brakes a little bit for you to think through some issues to make sure that you're ready to deal with it. So why don't we get started with that? So the first thing I want to tell people, of course, is look before you leap. Animal damage control, ADC work, it's not easy money, right? And so it's not something that, it's just where money's just falling off the sky. Those days are essentially gone. That was probably true back in certain parts of the country in the 80s and 90s, maybe into the early 2000s. But for in general terms, the easy money is already gone, right? So the parts of the country that needed wildlife control and it could sustain wildlife control as a business model, those places either have franchises or businesses serving those particular needs. It doesn't mean that you can't break in. It just means that there's going to be competition out there. So let me kind of take a break here and have you think about how would you find out about that? Well, one of the things you want to do is go to the U.S. Census, and let's get some population statistics for, let's just go with Denver. Let me pick an eastern city. How about Memphis, Tennessee? Okay. So we're going to go to and of course, AI here is answering that in Memphis, Tennessee, it has an estimated population of 602,000 people. The broader Memphis area is 1.34 million. Okay, that's a fair amount of people. Now, you need to have enough people in a location in order for you to make a living. Now, the only exceptions to that would be places that have second homes. And so places with second homes, you might be dealing with people, or you will be dealing with people. Many of them have a substantial amount of money, and they have the revenue to pay you to do work. And so you could probably make a go of it in those locations as well. But the bottom line is you're going to need people, and you need to have people that have expendable income. This is one of the challenges for people that work in, more rural areas. They're like, yeah, I really love trapping. I want to get out there and do it as a living, but I just can't seem to get customers. Well, the reason you can't get customers is because a lot of those folks are just going to take the shotgun and put it out their back window. They may want someone to do the work, but they don't value the work enough to pay you what it takes for you to make a living, or they don't have the money at all, right? So rural areas is really a mixture. You have people that have staggering amounts of wealth with other people who are just land rich but are broke. You need people with cash. So understand what you're getting into when we're looking at the field of wildlife control. Now, can you make a living off this? Yeah, absolutely, if you're in the right location. But there are people who are making far more than $100,000 a year, right? But those individuals tend to have employees. They tend to be in areas that have enough wealth. Their cost structure is low because they actually live there. They also have skills that other people don't have. And so they're able to get into those higher margin areas. Perhaps they do a lot of repair type work. Maybe they're doing bat work, right? And not something, if you're looking into wildlife control, bat work is not something I would encourage you to start your business with unless you have some carpentry, ladder skills, roofing skills that you're able to bring along as well, because not that it's rocket science, but that it does take a little bit of experience and equipment and understanding of what before you start charging people for. Because once you start charging for your labor, you have legal obligations involved here, right? So, all right, well, let's take a look at the next issues you think about, and that is the cost of wildlife control work. The fact of the matter is wildlife control work is equipment intensive. This is one of the things I really envy about the bug folks, right? The people that do pest control, they have their cute little trucks with a little B&G sprayer, strapped to the back of their open bed truck, and they're all clean and equipment's all nice and organized. That's a whole different world from wildlife control. Wildlife control, the equipment is bulky. You have traps. You've got different size traps. You have to have ladders. You have to have, of course, the flashlights. You have to have the screening. You've got to have the baits and lures. You've got to have, chimney caps on the back. It can be a real mess. Your catch pole. You have to have tools, of course, because you need to be able to install the exclusion materials. Even if you don't perform exclusion work, you're still going to need the tools because there are going to be situations where maybe you're going to be putting in a positive set or a blind set, and you need to block that animal and force the animal through the trap, right? So you're going to need some equipment. There's boards, you got to have screws, batteries, other types of tools. You need to get different size ladders to get into attics. You have to have all your PPE respiratory equipment. You may need ropes. You may need what we call a chicken ladder, a kind that goes over the ridge of a roof so you can then climb the roof, and there are different ways to do that. It is extraordinarily equipment intensive. And then, of course, you may be dealing with carcasses, right? So these are other challenges. So again, and if you've done maybe fur trapping before, or you're an outdoorsman, you get it. I just want to remind you that not all that's going to fit in your truck, right? So you're going to need to have a location where you can store this material. And will your neighbors complain about skunk odor, right? And so this is where do you house your company? Where do you start? Now, when I was in business, I did it out of my house, right? And there were times, the odor got a little heavy. Thankfully, I had neighbors, and they were fairly close. I only had the house that I lived at, I think we only had 1/8 of an acre, which isn't that big. Maybe even been less than that. I have to look it up. But I was in a metropolitan city, and you could underhand toss a softball and hit the neighbor's house, right? Without a lot of effort. So we were 70 feet away from another house, not a whole lot. And so people could smell stuff, right? And so this was one of the challenges. That means you got to have freezers in order to hold carcasses. You need to be making sure you're careful. You want to make sure that you're not, making a scene, and that you're keeping things under. People don't want to be seeing you killing animals. Of course, I wasn't able to use firearms in that situation because I was in a city, right? So here, these are some of those things you're going to have to think about. Third, you want to consider what you're exactly selling. Now, they may seem like a really odd question for you, but it's an idea that you need to thoroughly adopt and consider. Rob Erickson, who's probably maybe a godfather within the industry, he goes back, right? So he's really one of the individuals who launched in a very aggressive way the whole field, or industry, I should probably say, of wildlife control. Started a magazine, started a training event. His work, kind of a controversial figure to be sure, but anyone who, was groundbreaking obviously will be. But he basically said something one time that really struck me, and he said, "You are an undertaker. Your job is to do things that other people are unwilling or incapable of doing." The reality is that wildlife control is not rocket science, right? There's nothing that we're doing that someone else can't reasonably do. I mean, obviously, if something's too heavy to pick up, it's too heavy to pick up. But that's not unique to the wildlife control field. What we're doing is we're often handling animals and having to kill them. And a lot of people can't deal with that because they see themselves. And so he really, I think, struck a nerve there, and it really resonated with me. And I'm like, gosh, Rob, you are spot on. And I think he is spot on with that. So keep that in mind. You say, well, why do I need to care about this? Because how are you naming your company? How are you positioning your company? We've done a podcast on a particular franchise, for example, that doesn't do any lethal control, or maybe I should say their lethal control work is extraordinarily minimal because they spend all their energy doing one-way doors and exclusion. That's how they're marketing themselves. They're marketing themselves as sort of the non-lethal approach to vertebrate pest control. Now you see people with, vehicles out there and they'll say, critter crunchers or, kill them all, let God sort them out. I'm just throwing out some names here, but you get the idea, right? We kill them, .com or whatever the case may be. And I don't know if those are actual websites or not, but nevertheless, you get my point. But notice how you have two different companies positioning themselves in two different ways. So you need to be thinking about what the culture is in your particular area. Do they want to not know that you're killing animals, but know that you're doing it sort of like, yeah, we're not asking the questions about what's going on in the back of the store? Or do they want to know that you're not killing them? In some places, they want to know that you are killing them, right? I think that's certainly becoming less and less, unfortunately. But you're going to need to think about what exactly you're selling, because you're not really selling wildlife control. You're helping people get back to normal. And a customer, when he hires you, wants to feel good about themselves for hiring you. They want to know that they've made the right decision, and how and what you're offering has to feed into that sense of the customer's well-being. Okay, so how are you marketing your company? How are you titling your company? That's what you need to think of. When I was in business back in the day, my company was called Wildlife Removal Service. Notice how innocuous that is. It describes what I did, but it was ambiguous as to what happened to the animal, right? Now, Massachusetts required all animals taken off someone's property had to be destroyed. Right. But that wasn't in the title of my company. All right. I had one customer said, and the only one customer who said the reason he picked me over a competitor was that he thought the name of my company sounded more professional. Now, I could have lost people from that as well. Who knows? Right. But this is what you want to be thinking about if you're getting into wildlife control. And let me just sort of add in here, it's probably not the best idea to tie the company name to your personal name. Because what happens if you do something and you make someone really angry? Now they're associating you with the company, and that could be a problem. Now, a lot of people have very successful businesses. If your family line, if you're like third generation XYZ in a particular location, then maybe that's going to be a selling point for you. But you've got to kind of work through this a little bit before you make some final decisions on how you're titling your company. Tip number 4. Got 2 more to go, this one and the next one, and that is you need to understand the risks of doing the job. This job is not risk-free. Now, if you're doing pest control, of course, you're thinking about pesticide risks, right? Because you're exposed to a lot of pesticides. Not a lot of pesticides in vertebrate pest management. There are some, but again, that's a separate license, and a lot of wildlife control operators deliberately don't get into using pesticides. And that's part of their shtick, right? They tell the customer, look, we're going to control your mice with no pesticides. That's a marketing tip, right? That's part of the positioning that you're going to have. And nothing wrong with that, right? But you need to kind of know how you're working this. But nevertheless, you're going to have risks in this job, risks to you, and that is, of course, biological. These are the diseases. Animals are dirty. They carry diseases that can transmit to us. Some of them are potentially life-threatening, right? Now, I don't want to overstate the issue, right? People have been doing wildlife control for a very long period of time, but it's not zero. And you as a professional are going to be exposing yourself to more of those risks than the average person in the country. You're going to be crawling through those crawl spaces. You're going to be kneeling around through those attics. You're going to be in places where animals, you run the greater risk of getting bitten, of course, right? So you're going to be maybe crawling through feces because you didn't see it. Maybe your light wasn't good enough or you didn't position it properly. You're going to be aerosolizing things, maybe like hantavirus. Maybe you're going to stick your head up somewhere just to look real quick because you were too busy or too lazy or whatever the combination of the two, you didn't put your respirator on and you get a big whiff of histoplasmosis spores, right? There's risks. You also have risks, of course, of falling downstairs, getting into a vehicle accident. There's a lot of driving in wildlife control. You may be on a roof, falling off the roof, falling off your ladder kicking out. I had a boss who was working on a house. He was working on the garage, right? Garage roof. It was one floor. Nope. Once you're in this business for a while, you love one floor places, right? And so he put the ladder up on the garage and he was climbing it up. And for some reason, the feet kicked out on him. And so he reached for the gutter to grab onto the gutter. And then he stiff-armed his left arm to go straight down to stop his fall. Because he was doing a Flintstone, for those of you old enough to remember the cartoon Flintstones. His body was flat out. So he dropped his left arm, if you can see my finger there, to try to break his fall. Well, he broke his fall, but he split the joint at his elbow. And it basically took him out of business. And so because he had some loans out there, he bought my business, and he ultimately he had to go declare bankruptcy because he wasn't able to earn enough money to cover all the debt. And so this can happen to you, right? And so I don't want to overstate the risk, right? I mean, there's risks in other jobs, right? You could be in a job where there's an active shooter or whatever. There are different types of risks and different types of jobs. But you need to know what those risks are in advance and whether you're going to be comfortable with them. If you have phobias about, things that are dirty or enclosed spaces, or you're afraid of heights, you're going to have to, you can still do wildlife control, but your wildlife control options are going to be significantly limited, and you kind of need to know that in advance. Okay. Lastly, let's kind of close here. You need to make sure you're aware of the legal issues. Now, I have a whole presentation on the legal issues regarding wildlife control, but I just want to kind of highlight this one for you. And that is, when we're dealing with pest control and with wildlife, we're dealing with basically a couple of different agencies. And keep this in mind. So when we're looking at animals, who regulates animals, and by that I mean whether you can kill that animal or not, or take that animal or not, you're dealing with two agencies. You have the federal agency, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, they're not going to be doing a whole lot with you because most wildlife laws are actually governed by the state. The difference there is that the federal government is going to be telling us which animals are going to be threatened or endangered. They're called T&E animals, threatened and endangered. The animals that we're primarily dealing with in wildlife control, it's not an issue. We're dealing with an abundance of those animals, like raccoons, and skunks, and tree squirrels, right? You get the idea. So the agency that's going to be dealing with those are going to be your wildlife agency. They're the ones who regulate the taking of animals in the state. Okay. Now here I just have an example of the Minnesota DNR, Department of Natural Resources. In your state, it might be called Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, or the Wildlife Department. Whatever it is, you need to know who those are. Those are going to be the folks that tell you whether or not you can hunt an animal at a particular time of year, how you can trap it, that sort of, which animals are open for taking and which ones are not open for taking. What confuses people is when we get into the pesticide side of things. Sometimes people who have a pest control license. A pest control license means that you have been given authorization to use pesticides that are restricted use. Now, if you have a commercial category, that allows you to use pesticides on someone else's property. I don't know of any state in the country that doesn't require someone to have a commercial pesticide license to apply pesticides on someone else's ground. One exception that I believe, and I'm not sure it's still true, and that is Nebraska does allow people to use repellents on someone else's ground, but not the types of pesticides that kill. But nevertheless, as a general rule, if you want to use a chemical to kill an animal and control an animal, you're going to need to get a pesticide license. Now, what's confusing is people think, all right, I have this pesticide license. I am now legal to control that animal. And that's not true, because the Department of the EPA, and your Department of Agriculture, they regulate pesticides. They don't regulate the wildlife. So all they can tell you is that it's whether it's legal or not for you to use a particular chemical to manage the animal. They don't tell you whether you have the right to control that animal. So think of it like this. You have a bug on the table. Someone hands you a hammer and says you now have the legal right to use that hammer, but you need another permission from someone who says you can use that hammer to kill that animal. That's what comes with the wildlife agency. So frequently, you're going to need to have 2 licenses to do vertebrate control. One license to allow you to take animals outside of the season, and that'll be granted to you by your Division of Fisheries and Wildlife or your wildlife agency in your state. And if you want to use pesticides, then you're going to need to get another license from your Department of Agriculture that will give you the ability to use that tool. But in order to use that tool on wildlife, you're going to need to be sure you have the wildlife license to control animals out of season. Now, there are exceptions to that. That's when we're dealing with animals that are not regulated. For example, house mice. House mice are an animal that are not regulated by, I'm not aware of any state in the country that regulates house mice. It's an invasive species, so it can be killed at will. So therefore, the wildlife agency won't give you a license to kill mice because anyone can kill them for any reason whatsoever. You do need to have the pesticide license. See how this gets a little nuanced. So my point ultimately is before you get into the wildlife control field, and there is room for you if you want to do this, you're going to need to make sure you contact your wildlife agency. And if you want to do pesticide work, you're going to have to be sure to get a hold of the Department of Agriculture and get your licenses there as well. So ultimately, I hope this has been helping you. 5 tips for getting into success into the area of wildlife damage management, because it's the bar to get in is pretty low. They don't have a lot of requirements, but there are some requirements, and there are things that you need to think about before you pull the trigger and get into the wildlife control. I encourage people, start small, work your way into it. Get a little bit of equipment and start working your way into, read a little bit about it. There should be no rush per se, but you can get into this field. Maybe you just want to make it as a little cash cow hobby or something, right? Where you can make a little money as a side gig. And that's certainly available. I think there's a tremendous need for some of that, right? But nevertheless, hope those issues were helpful. If you want to learn more on the control of those animals and how to get things started in your company, this is particularly one book. There's also another one available on my website by Mr. Phil Nichols. That is a book that he written. It has a little bit more of a business approach to things in it. So that's available for you as well. And of course, we'll be discussing this particular topic again in the future. Thanks for watching. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions for future shows, I do hope you'll reach out to me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you also want to be on the show or you know of a particular person or subject we should be covering, perhaps we should have a guest, definitely let me know as well. We'd love to have them, reach out to them and have them on the show if they so wish. All right. Well, until next time, take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.